Welcome back to our Bible study on the book of Daniel for St Andrew's Church in Southgate. I am Father Ed, I'm the vicar here. If you are joining from anywhere else, you are most welcome. The first session was really just laying the groundwork, giving the context, which is really critical to understanding the book. So if you haven't watched the first session, then I suggest you do so. Now we're going to get into the text. There's a lot of text to cover, so I'm not going to read it. You'll need to get your Bible open in front of you. It doesn't matter which translation, it just gives us more things to consider and seeing how different people have translated certain words. Right, so what I will do is I'll put the words up on the screen anyway, so you can see them. So here we are in Babylon. This is Neo-Babylon, but it will remind us of the Babylon of old, the Babylon that stands for humanity's attempt to establish itself an earthly paradise, the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, constructed to storm the heights of heaven. And this Neo-Babylon is not so different. We have the mighty Nebuchadnezzar, who is sort of godlike in his stature and sees himself as all-powerful. He builds the Hanging Gardens of Babylon a little bit like a new Tower of Babel. Babylon is the sort of the human edifice which is compared throughout this book with Jerusalem, the city of God. Nebuchadnezzar is not just a historical figure in this. I think he stands as the epitome of opposition to God, a type of all opponents of the divine city and the divine order. When he takes Jerusalem, the treasures are taken from the temple, but also the human treasures. The human cream of the crop is taken. All the leaders and bright young things, human trophies. We deal first of all in the text with the physical treasures of the temple, because for the rest of the book we're going to be looking at the people who make up the human trophies, and they're our main interest for the rest of the story, and how they are able to maintain their distinctive character as Jewish people and remain separate from their pagan overlords throughout this exile. So just draw attention to the name, the land of Shinar. That is sort of the suburbs, the area around Babylon. We think that maybe they were settled, the Jews, in sort of old ruined cities or deserted cities, that sort of thing, where they would at least be able to live together and make a life for themselves, even if from a low state. But of course, the most impressive, we're about to find out in the next bit of text, the most impressive people, the youngest, brightest, best looking, will be snatched away and taken to work much closer to the king in the courts and palaces. So here we go. Ashpenaz might be the name of a particular palace master, but it might also describe a rank, like sort of chief eunuch, something like that. His responsibility seems to be to educate maybe the royal princes, to make sure the well-being of the royal harem. And on this occasion, he is expected to spot future diplomats from among the Jewish nobility. There is a sort of an attempt to absorb the best of the young Judean exiles into the Babylonian court. Physical perfection as well as intelligence were vital to being chosen, I suppose because you're sort of representing as well, and that sort of thing. It might remind us a bit of the stipulations around temple sacrifices, having to be sort of immaculate and perfect to be used in the temple. But there's something a bit showy about having all these very good-looking, bright young men around as well. Kind of makes me think a little bit of sort of Gaddafi's female honour guard, something like that. Now, if they are expected to be spotless in the sight of Nebuchadnezzar, they are even more so expected to be in the sight of God. Of course, from a Babylonian point of view, they are waiting to see how these young men perform in their society. But for us, the readers, they bear an even greater responsibility for representing Israel in a special way. And how are they going to be Israel, the people of God, in this courtly work? So they're now going to need specialised training, even if they are already bright young things and may already have had positions of standing in Judean society. They would now need specialist training on the Babylonian way of doing things. The word Chaldean, originally meant the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, but this usage reflects a later Greco-Roman usage, which meant a sort of professional class of astrologers, wise men, magicians, that sort of thing. The custom of providing food from the table of the king for favoured attendants was commonplace and a great honour. But there is a problem. Why would accepting food be a problem for these young Jewish men? Well, there's three main reasons. Firstly, the food that is offered to them might be forbidden by Levitical law, might not be kosher. These may not be clean animals. We know from history that the Babylonians ate horse, for example. The second reason would be that the food may not be free from blood, and that again is an issue. Deuteronomy 12 verse 23, there are various rules around blood being like the sort of sacred life essence of life, that you shouldn't that in some way you shouldn't touch it. I suppose it's a whole nother video, but we might think, for example, of the double bind of the priest in the Good Samaritan, who doesn't go over and save the guy, partly because he doesn't want to get his hands blooded. Or we might think of the woman hemorrhaging, again with that sort of double bind. She's a woman in society. She's a woman who is bleeding, and that's a real problem. Makes her untouchable. And then the third reason is that the food, particularly the meat, may have been offered to idols or involved in some kind of pagan ritual. So these dietary laws, they often became important for the Jews in exile, and because it was a way of remaining separate, of being identified, and I think still to this day it's a way of marking people out, and prevents really a full sort of mealtime fellowship between Jew and Gentile. Let's have a little look at the names. So the names are changed, which again was not uncommon at that time, to sort of assimilate. The names before Hananiah means God has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. And Azariah means God has helped. Any names sort of ending in El or Aya are references to God, Yahweh. The new names are Babylonian and connected with Babylonian deities. So Daniel is given the name Belshazzar, protect the life of the king, which is significant and will become more significant as we go through. The names Shadrach and Meshach are connected with the god Marduk, one of the main gods of the Babylonian people, sometimes called Bel as well. Shadrach means I am very fearful of Marduk, and Meshach means I am of little account before Marduk. Abednego refers to a different god Nabu, the Shining One, and Abednego means something like the son of the Shining One. So in our Zoom Bible study session, we had long and really interesting conversations about name changes and the way name changing has been used by various societies over the years to mark people out, to assimilate, to oppress. And that is definitely something for us to consider here. But this is not where Daniel and his friends draw the line, not with the name changes. Their names, well, Daniel's name still continues for us anyway, because that's who the author talks of, and that's their names known to God, if you like. So they don't draw the line there. It is with the food laws, and it's that to which we turn now. So the youths have to think through this cross-cultural change that they have had and the principles involved in their actions. And I suppose they sort of need to begin as they mean to go on. How can you fit in without being swallowed in a foreign society? Daniel accepts the re-education, although he will in fact not gain wisdom from the Babylonians so much, but from the direct revelation of God. And he'll accept the name change, but protests at the food supplied from the royal table. And one would imagine that this might appear incredibly insulting also. So there's this plan that Daniel cooks up to swap the meals. Of course, that would probably mean that the guard and the palace official would be able to eat the good food. So it's a win-win for everyone. It works out well. And Daniel's suggestion shows wisdom. It shows that he is a wise man. The literal translation for vegetables is sort of seeds or seed pods. So we're probably talking about grains of some kind. And 10 is probably just a symbolic number, as meaning sort of the maximum, or enough. That's a period to go without the food. And what do we learn from this? The outcome of this? Well, God has not deserted them. God is very much in control. The allowance of the request in itself is a minor miracle and confirms that God is working through all the people in the story. And as a result of this adherence to the food laws, God blesses these young Jewish men, giving great gifts, both of physical well-being, which is surprising and miraculous, but also of extraordinary intellectual powers as well. Again, in our Zoom Bible study, we considered, what are the religious lines you would draw, and when, or have you? Even a small act of self-discipline taken out of loyalty to principle sets God's servants in the line of his approval and blessing. In this way, actions attest faith, and the character is strengthened to face more difficult situations in the future. I suppose it's one of the reasons we engage with a Lenten fast each year. It's not so much about the giving up of chocolate or alcohol or rich foods. It's a preparation to see how much greater a responsibility we might be able to take. And it's really important in this situation, this small detail, you might think, because on the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends rests the future of God's people. You might also say that the ultimate consequences of this faithful, lawful diet they're incalculable. It's a matter of God's victory, if you like, or God's defeat. This is, in these simple meals, is the Tower of Babel being sort of played out again. If they slip in one law, what next? studying a sort of a foreign culture, is not in itself a dangerous thing to do. I think that's important, something for us to take on board. Sometimes there can be nervousness about studying other cultures or other religions. That is not a problem for Daniel and his friends. But at this point, they have to prove that God is the beginning of that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The king is very impressed with them. They outdo all the local native experts. God bestows wisdom, so he can give wisdom to outdo any other so-called wise people. Wisdom comes from God. 10 times, again, it's an exaggeration, it's hyperbole, a sort of maximum number. It's so much greater that really it shows that this is an unfair competition. This is normal humans versus God and God's wisdom. There's going to be no contest. So they are stationed in the king's court. It's a great honour. And we're told that Daniel will continue this great honour until King Cyrus, which is good news for us listening to the story. It should put our minds at ease, at least for Daniel, because King Cyrus will mark the end of the exile and the people being able to return to Judah. And so we know that Daniel's he's going to pull through. So we go into chapter 2. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the all-powerful one, who is able to bestow all kinds of favours or not. He is now he is now troubled, a frustrated person, unnerved, possibly even forgetful. It's possible. The king's personal crisis gives Daniel an opportunity to minister to him. And that sort of tugs on my heartstrings as a priest, I think. And he's troubled, of course, the king by these bad dreams. We don't know if it's a recurring dream or if it's the fact that he can't remember it or can't quite put his finger on it that gives him great woe and anxiety. It was a common belief of the age that rulers' dreams had a special significance. You might see also Abimelech in Genesis 20 verse 3, or Pharaoh in Genesis 41 verse 1, or Solomon in 1 Kings 3. And this is something we'll come back to later, that kings are given a special position by God, and therefore have a special responsibility as a conduit of God's blessings. And so that it would therefore follow that kings' visions and dreams may well be more significant than most. Essentially here we see Daniel stepping into the shoes of Joseph. The story is so similar. Joseph finding himself in the court of Pharaoh, interpreting dreams, receiving rewards, and his status going up. It's basically the same sort of story, it's said again in a different sort of a way, sort of a midrash. And what effect that has is that it puts Daniel on a level with the patriarchs. But here, the remembering of the dream itself is new. That wasn't an issue for Joseph. Now the king wants the dream itself remembered. The fact that we don't know the contents of the dream makes this a real cliffhanger. So it has a wonderfully sort of it's powerful from a literary point of view as well. The court seers were responsible for interpreting the king's dreams. They were paid, they were fed, they were housed well, so they better be able to sort things out. Otherwise the king's going to want to know what on earth he's been paying for. And that we have this lovely list of all the types of seer, just to make clear that everyone was called and none of them had a clue. And it shows how troubled Nebuchadnezzar is. But here, as in the story of Joseph, human wisdom and magic is deemed useless. Why does the king want the dream remembered and told again? There's a few possibilities. One is that he has forgotten the dream. We often wake troubled by dreams and that almost disappear from the memory immediately. Interestingly, in Eastern superstition, it was ominous not to be able to remember a dream. It can mean that the gods are angry with you, so that would be enough to get Nebuchadnezzar troubled. The second reason is it may be that he simply wanted to test his wise men, who he pays an awful lot of money for, because he believes his wise men will just fob him off, maybe until times change, until things come to pass anyway, or the king forgets the incident. The third reason is that, and I think this is the most interesting one, that Nebuchadnezzar refuses to present its content because there is a psychological barrier against a revealed truth whose fatal implication he senses. Very close parallels to the story of Joseph as the recipient of a divine dream. Until the dream is remembered and interpreted, it hung over the king as a sort of an evil dream. There's a strong contrast between the attitude of Daniel and that of the king. On one side we have fear leading to threatening and violence, but also to no avail. On the other we have faith marked by prayer and a spirit of thanksgiving. And there's a sort of peaceful serenity to the figure of Daniel as well. The threatening shows the king's frustration. And unfortunately there is plenty of historical evidence that such threats were often carried out. One line that is particularly telling is that from the supposed wise men who say in verse 10, "There is indeed no one on earth who can tell." And that is correct, and that is the point of a large part of this story, that wisdom and insight must come from God, and that we as humans simply have our limits. We'll move on to the next bit of text. So again, we the contrast between Daniel's calmness and the king's kind of loss of control and violent rage he goes into. And Daniel's question is interesting. It's concerned with the hastiness rather than the severity of the decree. He's sort of calming things and sort of slowing things. Why does Daniel ask for more time? That's interesting because, of course, the king's already gone absolutely crazy because his supposed wise men have just asked for more time. And you think, oh dear, can't believe Daniel's just done the same as well. But the point is that he is waiting to talk to God. And he's asking for more time for a very different reason. He asks his companions to join him in prayer. And that is, of course, a pattern that we will see later in Jesus' ministry, where he takes off a few friends to support him in that prayer, or to pray with him. Daniel shows sort of prudence and discretion. He's thinking sort of calmly under pressure and exercising faith in the moment of crisis. But nonetheless, it's pretty heart-pounding stuff, especially given that the magicians had also asked for more time and been accused of stalling. We move on to the next bit of text. Okay, so a vision is more significant than a dream, um, but together they can be prophetic instruments. The difference between a vision and a dream, well, possibly that a vision, you don't have to be asleep, or you're not asleep, you're not quite asleep, as opposed to a dream, but also that a dream can come from the human imagination, but a vision comes from the imagination of God. And it is through this that God makes his wisdom available. And we might be reminded of all kinds of other dreams, like Job's dream, like Jacob's dream, those sort of things. God understands the way to wisdom. God alone knows its source. That's what Job has to say on this. Daniel knows this, and it is the source of his humility and also his boldness. So then we have this wonderful prayer. It starts with a sort of a standard liturgical synagogue expression, "Blessed be the name of God from age to age." So it gives us some idea of Jewish liturgies in Aramaic, which is a rather useful and nice thing. It is normal that a description of God's deeds follows, as that is what we are to recognise and give praise for. So that's the next pattern, part of the pattern of the prayer. It is God who changes the times and seasons. That's, of course, fairly important to the story, to a time of exile. The prayer of thanksgiving rejects the idea of the influence of the stars on human fate and history. Instead, we have an emphasis on God's omnipotence. So it's a prayer against the Babylonian system of understanding the world and time and history. But also there's the other big difference between the Babylonian sort of pagan faith and this Jewish faith is in the personal connection. This is a God that deals personally with people and is interested in individuals as well as nations. In verse 23 we have me, we. This is an immanent God who, connects personally with his people, unlike the transcendent gods of Babylon that need all kinds of intermediaries. God makes himself immanent for his people's sake. So the faith of Daniel is in God's very being, God's sovereignty, that nothing is beyond God's control, and in the personal concern of God. The last 4 lines express Daniel's own amazement at the privilege of the share in God's wisdom and strength that he is given. The end sort of links us back to the beginning. It's sort of a beautiful bit of poetry. It's a beautiful prayer. Let's go on to the next bit of text. Just an interesting little note. Arioch, he sort of plays down Daniel's credentials. Instead, he sort of claims the credit for himself in finding someone to meet the king's request. And then we see the foil to that is Daniel, who plays down his own credentials and gives honour to God. He wants to deny any special power or qualification within himself. Only God can interpret the dreams. This affirms that the magicians were not hatching a plan against Nebuchadnezzar. So actually, by saying that actually only God could interpret it, Daniel also does them a favour. These people that were doing him no favours, he exonerates them. And sadly, they continue to do the opposite and accuse him and his friends. But God has also been speaking to the king through his dreams. So that should remind us that God is always trying to connect with all his people, including Nebuchadnezzar personally. The end of days, that usually refers to a crisis in Israelite history. It points to the end of this age and the inauguration of a new age of God's rule. We've got a great big chunk of text here with the interpretation. What is really important here is the way it's lined up. Before Daniel gets into the interpretation, he sort of bigs up the king, doesn't he? But it's not just about flattery or diplomacy. There is a real link to Genesis here, to primordial man who has authority, is given authority over nature, over the animals, and humanity really, and so there is unbelievable sort of authority and responsibility placed in the hands of a king by God. The king exercises royal power given to humanity in creation to subdue the earth, steward the creatures. And then this image of this statue, which is huge, it's extraordinary, it is frightening. It's obviously human shaped, but it's like a golem, like an idol. It cannot move. It sort of has no real life in it. The Babylonians would have been used to sort of huge images and statues. They had plenty of their own, so this would be an image they could recognise. But this is a top-heavy statue. It has huge vulnerability. It's liable to toppling. The materials go down in quality. There's a sort of degeneration. There are various interpretations of what the different materials, which kingdoms they symbolise. But the one that I think must be the case, backed up by other historical accounts as well, of the way they understood the rise and fall of various empires in the ancient world, is that, as we are told anywhere in the text, the golden head stands for Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, the silver for the Medes, the bronze for Persia, and the iron for Greece. And that mingling of iron and clay is the division of Alexander the Great's empire between various generals, but the ones that concern us here in Judea, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and the failed marriage union that led to all-out conflict. The Seleucids are the iron, they are strong, and the Ptolemies are sort of brittle, they sort of crumble, although they have some of the strength of iron within them. So that leaves us with the stone. The stone is the kingdom of God, coming with judgment on the human kingdoms. It is decisive and final, not built by human hands. This is divine action. Underlying the empires, the human empires, is an insatiable will to domination, and that is why they contain within themselves the seeds of destruction. Human power is derived from God, so the king's pride in his power and great culture is misplaced. As great as Nebuchadnezzar is, he will not live forever. The killing blow may strike the feet where the weakness is, but the whole statue is smashed to pieces. It is weak because of its composite character, and we're told the wind removes any trace of it. So we have kind of all peoples and all time encapsulated in one figure. They exist at the same time, coexisting. They are destroyed at the same time, all together. I think this says that God's time is different to our time. We cannot predict the end because God's time is so different to ours. Really, there is just one long idolatrous kingdom, and in this case 4 reigns. 4 eras, if you like. And perhaps it doesn't matter really what those kingdoms are, which ones they are, because they all stand together. Time is all put in one great big figure. They could stand for any kingdom, from Rome to Napoleon's kingdom, to the British Empire, to Nazi Germany. The stone coming not from human hands shows that God acts independently from human politics. The expansion of the stone is the symbol of the universality of God's kingdom. It grows into a mountain. Now for Israel, of course, God rules from Mount Zion. Psalm 48, verses 2 to 3. So, having grown in the dream, Israel, God's reign, it occupies its proper place on the earth. That is everywhere. The kingdom of God and Israel they are sort of synonymous here. And Jewish people would be reminded of the account of David and Goliath. The statue is toppled much in the same way. The Babylonians or the Greeks may appear to be winning right now. They might be the winning teams, but great things begin in small packages, as of course Jesus will later tell us with the mustard seed. So this small rock is sort of the mustard seed. Another angle is that, of course, in Genesis, all peoples are connected with their own ancestor, and then all humanity is connected with Adam. So this is like, in a way, it's like a huge Adam with an Achilles heel. Of course, in apocalyptic literature, the Messiah comes as the new Adam to help humanity discover its lost unity. So that new Adam is sort of the rock that turns into the mountain. So we as Christians would almost certainly think of not just the kingdom of God, but of the Messiah bringing about that kingdom of God, the rock not made by human hands, the precious cornerstone, who calls out that the kingdom of God is nigh. Then this section ends by saying, Daniel says, the dream is certain. It's absolute. It's he's quite sure of it. The dream was about power, so its interpretation is also a test of power. This is God's revelation of mystery. Mystery is knowledge which is not accessible by any ordinary means. And that's an essential element of apocalyptic writing, that only God can reveal God's plans, these great mysteries. But Nebuchadnezzar, not really interested in apocalypse or the end of days, no more than some of our recent leaders of nations are concerned with environmental calamity, which might face the planet. But it's certainly, if nothing else, it is a dream about that should include some element of humility for Nebuchadnezzar. Let's see what happens. So there is a reversal. The arrogance of sort of a king like Nebuchadnezzar, who makes themselves almost gods to be worshipped by humans. Nebuchadnezzar now finds himself bowing down to a man, Daniel. And, of course, that also might indicate to us that he hasn't quite understood Daniel's religion and faith, and not really listened to what he said, because Daniel was saying, do not bow to me, it's all come from God. He doesn't ask questions about the future, even though the dream clearly talks about it. He doesn't ask any more questions about Daniel's God. There's a sort of fleeting interest in it. He's just relieved that the dream is out of his head and has an explanation, really, and probably more focused on the fact that he's a golden head than on the obliteration of the statue in the end. So there's a certain arrogance still here, definitely. And he can easily say, well, okay, Daniel's god is great as well. He's a polytheist, so he can add another god to his pantheon. That's not really a problem. Then, of course, we have the king's extravagant honours that he bestows. Just as he was extravagant in the punishments he was going to hand out. And really, this is sort of an abuse of power either way. Daniel and his companions, they do prosper in this case. But prosperity, it sort of saves out of life. But only righteousness can sort of save out of death. Okay. Let's go on to, let's see how Nebuchadnezzar's new humility shows itself. It doesn't. You would think that having heard about a troubling dream in which a giant statue of which you are the head is smashed into pieces and lost forever, you might rather go off statues. But no. Chapter 3 begins with Nebuchadnezzar making the biggest statue ever. And I think unfortunately this shows us that religious experiences can create impressive responses, but they can still leave untouched the depths of our being. He's heard that he's the head of gold, and he's kind of made that into a charter to build bigger and better. It is very. It's very reminiscent of, sort of the statue of Zeus in the temple built by Antiochus Epiphanes. And we don't know what the image is of. Could be an image of himself, possibly. It could be an image of Marduk, his own god. But the dimensions are really weird. We're talking about sort of 90 feet high, but really not very wide at all. Like a Nelson's column or something. I mean, some people have said maybe it was a column with sort of a figure on the top. But I think it certainly feels to me like it's a phallic symbol. This, far from showing his humility, this is kind of showing off. And I think that this is humorous. I think it's intended to be humorous. The last thing we expect him to do is build a massive statue, and a statue that may be phallic as well, and then add to this unbelievable sort of ordering of dignitaries that are all called out from all their usual duties. They've all got to come out and bow to this statue at the same time. It makes me think of the ladies of the harem of the court of King Caractacus, as they're all sort of filing out. All the peoples and all nations. It shows the king's desire to assimilate and to make the state religion a focal point of unity and universality of his empire. And perhaps he thinks that this will solve the dangerous mixture of the statue in the dream and give his society unity. Right. The other thing that's really interesting here, though, and possibly takes us from comedy to a slightly darker tone, is that the instruments appear to be Semitic in origin. They seem to be sort of Jewish instruments. And whether he is trying to sort of enter into the spirit of Daniel's religion or pay him homage in this way, or whether this might even be a parody of a Jewish celebration, maybe the Jewish celebration of New Year, where the shofar is sounded. Either way, it shows his pomp and his pretension. It's sort of bawdy and lewd. So This would be a big problem for a Jew to take part in, particularly if it's a parody of Jewish faith. So now we have a real threat to martyrdom. Let's go on. So at first it seems that the king has sort of achieved his goal. He's created unity. But unfortunately, ambitious people seek their own advantage at the expense of others under a megalomaniac king. The professional wise men are jealous of the position of the Jews, positions they would forfeit if punished. So there's an awful lot in it for these professional wise men. They can take their positions. And the phrase of sort of denouncing, it literally means 8 pieces of. This is really vicious, it's slanderous. There is, the idea that they have paid the king no heed, that they is just rubbish, absolute rubbish. They've been excellent administrators of the affairs of the kingdom. So we see the way anti-Semitism readily embraces economic, social, political and racial accusations. If it wasn't for these informers, the king probably would never have known. Let's see the king's reaction. So, he's in a furious rage. We know that's dangerous. He's out of control. These men, they didn't seek an open clash with the king's authority. Neither do they want to be martyrs. That's made clear in what they say to the king. Yeah, and there's an important question for us and for modern prayer, for our modern prayer lives, if you like. What we expect, and when we ask for things, or maybe when we don't receive those things, we don't like it when the answer is no. These young men say that if God does save them, that's obviously a positive. But either way, they are willing to die for their loyalty to God, even if he chooses not to deliver them. So their faithfulness is without expectation of reward. They do it because it is the right thing, and that's it. That's a very important point for us. So he is so filled with rage that his face was distorted. This is, this is a big kid, a very dangerous big kid with loads of power, who is acting in a beastly and childish way and having a tantrum, unable to contain their fury. His very face is contorted in this, and it's his pride that's been hurt, because this is a challenge to his authority. He's losing control. Maybe that stone that hits the statue in the dream, it has just hit. He didn't see it coming, and suddenly his whole kingdom and all the rest of it is on shaky ground by the sort of faithfulness of these 3 young men. So he demands the furnace is ridiculously hot. 7 times, not actually possible, of course, because thermostats haven't been invented yet, but it's a sort of a perfect number of perfectly wicked rage. The temperature of the furnace really it indicates for us the temperature of the king's rage. It is as hot as it could possibly be, and he's going to need the strongest guards, and he's going to need them bound and all this sort of thing. Interestingly, they go through the items of clothes they're wearing, whether that sort of helps us get a sense of the miracle later on, that the fire doesn't sort of burn any part of them, or it shows that they are very pious and they're sort of covered up. But the fire kills his own people. Such was his rage. It doesn't take a whole sermon to remind us that when we are rageful, we often hurt the people closest to us and the people that we don't intend to, rather than being able to direct it purely where the anger should be directed. Death by fire was a cruel execution used by Persia, but also particularly by Antiochus Epiphanes as a form of punishment in his attempt to suppress Judaism. So again, if this is written in the 2nd century BC, this is very, very pertinent, and death by fire needs sort of addressing. It needs addressing from a sort of a theological point of view. And fire, of course, comes up a lot in the Old Testament. Psalm 66 talks of the danger of fire and water. Jeremiah talked of Nebuchadnezzar killing Jews by fire. But it's also worth noting that fire is often associated with theophanies, appearing of God. Think, for example, the burning bush or the pillar of fire. But at the same time, in Deuteronomy 4:20, we are told that the exodus from Egypt was salvation from the furnace. So God is both present in the fire and rescuing from the fire. And I'll just mention at this point, this is where you will find in some Bibles the insertion of an apocryphal and later bit of writing, which is the prayer of these three men, a prayer of thanksgiving before God, which we call the Benedicite, and we sometimes use that in our own worship. A beautiful prayer. Let's go on to verse 24. The Jews are to welcome death rather than turn aside from their faith. That seems to be the point here. The three youths demonstrate that Nebuchadnezzar can do all he wants. He can rant, he can rave, he can kill, he can maim, but he is still unable to make the Jews give up their faith. His power is great, but it's not absolute. In fact, all the fire can do is hurt his own people and loose the very bonds that had bound these men. Again, it's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar is the one that sees the miracle. We're not sure anyone else does. And that seems to be a feature of Daniel particularly, that miracles are only witnessed by the one it concerns. And again, that his vision of not only the three men being okay, but also this fourth stranger being with them as well, is an acting out of that rock hitting the statue. This is the incoming of a strange new kingdom. The fourth person with the appearance of a god, or the face of a god, or the face of an angel. We think this is an angel being described here. For us Christians, we might say that this may even be a sort of messianic appearance of some kind. There's also this question of where Daniel is in this story. It's totally missing. Is it possible that Daniel in some way makes sort of an angelic appearance? Let's go on. The last bit now. So what the king declares is really something that looks a lot like a sort of a resurrection. But his poetic praise it sort of seems wonderful on the one hand, but it's almost like he sort of appropriates for his own use the songs and praises of Israel, which may be positive, but it may still concern us, I suppose, given that, a minute ago he had them all using sort of Jewish instruments to worship an idol. The king sort of reaffirms his faith in the God of the Jews, and now he makes a royal decree, demands the universal recognition of the unique power of the Jewish God, but he does so in a way that is full of the threatening lunacy of a megalomaniac again. If they don't worship this God of the Jews, they'll be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. He may rather have missed the point. But I suppose for now, and this is where we're going to have to stop in this session, these young men have won for the Jewish people in exile religious tolerance and protection to some extent. Okay, I think that's more than enough. So hopefully join us for session 3 soon. Thank you very much. Bye.